The restaurant was loud, silverware clinking, glasses toasting, laughter filling every corner. But at table 15, the most dangerous man in the city sat in absolute silence. He didn't come here for dinner. He came here to meet someone who was supposed to be dead. But before the waiter even reached his table, something slid across the floor and touched his shoe. A crumpled napkin. He almost ignored it until he saw the handwriting. Small, shaky, written in a child's hand. Just one word, help. He looked up. Across the room, a little girl stood frozen beside her mother. Her lips trembling, her eyes begging, her tiny hand still half hidden behind her dress, as if she wasn't sure the message had reached the right person. Behind her, a man in a leather jacket tightened his grip on her shoulder. Too tight, possessive, dangerous. The waiter walked right past her, completely missing the fear carved into her eyes. But the Mafia boss didn't. His fingers slowly curled around the napkin, crushing it like a trigger he was seconds away from pulling. She had chosen him. Of all people in this room, she had chosen the one man capable of turning a quiet dinner into a war zone. And when he stood up, every bodyguard in the room froze because they had never seen that look in his eyes. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will shake the entire criminal underworld and reveal why this little girl risked everything to reach the monster at table 15. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. Marco Benedetti had been called many things in his 43 years: monster, king, devil. But tonight, sitting in Castellano's Italian bistro, he was just a man waiting for answers about a betrayal that had cost him everything 6 months ago. The restaurant buzzed with the usual Friday night crowd, couples celebrating anniversaries, families sharing pasta, business deals being struck over wine. None of them knew they were eating dinner 20 feet away from the head of the most feared crime family on the East Coast. Marco preferred it that way. Anonymity was power. The moment people recognized you, they either ran or started planning your funeral. He'd learned that lesson watching his father get gunned down outside a pizzeria when he was 12. His fingers drummed against the white tablecloth as he scanned the room. Danny should have been here 15 minutes ago. Danny, his former lieutenant, his childhood friend, the man who had supposedly died in a warehouse explosion that destroyed $3 million worth of merchandise and nearly triggered a war between the families. But Danny wasn't dead. Marco had proof, photos, bank records, witness statements from people too terrified to lie. Danny had staged his own death, stolen the money, and was now living under a new identity in Miami. Tonight was supposed to be their reunion. Marco had sent word through the old channels. A simple message. Table 15, Castellano's 9 o'clock. Come alone or don't come at all. The clock on the wall read 9:17. Marco's jaw tightened. Disrespect was a cancer in his world. You let one person get away with it, and suddenly everyone thought they could test you. He'd built his reputation on swift, brutal responses to even the smallest slights. But before he could signal his men to start looking for Danny, something caught his attention. A flash of movement near the hostess station. A family being seated 3 tables away. The woman was in her 30s, blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing a floral dress that had seen better days. She kept glancing toward the exit, her hands shaking as she reached for her water glass. The man beside her was older, maybe mid-40s, with graying temples and expensive clothes that didn't quite hide the hardness in his eyes. He spoke in low, controlled tones, his hand resting possessively on the woman's arm. And between them sat a little girl, maybe 8 years old, with dark hair and enormous brown eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. Something about the scene felt wrong. Marco had spent decades reading people, learning to spot lies, fear, and danger in the tilt of a head or the twitch of an eye. This wasn't a happy family dinner. The woman flinched when the man leaned over to whisper something in her ear. The little girl sat perfectly still, like she was afraid that moving might trigger something terrible. Marco's attention might have drifted back to watching for Danny, but then the little girl turned and looked directly at him. Most children would have looked away immediately, intimidated by his cold stare. This one held his gaze for 3 full seconds, and in those seconds, Marco saw something he recognized. Pure, desperate terror. The kind of fear that came from knowing you were trapped with no way out. The same fear he'd seen in his own reflection after his father's murder. when the rival families circled like vultures, waiting to carve up their territory. The little girl's eyes darted to her napkin, then back to Marco. She picked up her crayon, the one she'd been using to color the children's menu, and began writing something. Marco watched as she carefully tore off a corner of her napkin and crumpled it into a tiny ball. The man beside her was focused on his phone, scrolling through messages with the intensity of someone conducting business. The woman stared at her untouched plate of food, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. That's when the little girl made her move. She dropped the crumpled napkin and gave it a small kick under the table. Marco watched it roll across the restaurant floor, weaving between chair legs and server stations until it came to rest against his Italian leather shoe. He bent down slowly, his movements casual, like he was adjusting his pant leg. His fingers closed around the tiny ball of paper. When he unfolded it, his blood turned to ice. The word was written in purple crayon, the letters uneven and shaky, but unmistakably clear. Marco's eyes snapped back to the little girl. She was still watching him, her small face a mask of controlled panic. She gave the slightest nod, confirming what he already knew. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This child was in genuine danger. The man at their table suddenly looked up from his phone, his gaze sweeping the restaurant with the practiced awareness of someone accustomed to watching for threats. When his eyes passed over Marco, they lingered for just a moment too long. Recognition flickered there, not the kind that came from seeing someone on the news or in a photograph. This was the recognition of one predator identifying another. Marco folded the napkin and slipped it into his jacket pocket. His mind was already calculating angles, exits, witnesses, and the number of innocent people who might get caught in crossfire if this situation exploded into violence. But first, he needed to understand what he was dealing with. The man's phone buzzed. He answered it with a curt, his voice carrying just far enough for Marco to catch fragments. Something about a schedule, a departure time. The phrase package delivery spoken with the kind of emphasis that suggested it wasn't about shipping boxes. Marco's jaw clenched. In his world, packages often referred to people who were being moved against their will. The waiter approached their table, a young kid with nervous energy and a smile that suggested he was working for tips. The man ordered for all three of them without consulting the woman or child. "We're in a hurry," he told the waiter. "Make it quick." The woman's hands were trembling so badly she could barely hold her water glass. The little girl sat motionless, her coloring abandoned, her eyes now fixed on the table as if she was afraid to look up again. Marco's phone vibrated. A text from Sal, one of his lieutenants positioned near the front entrance. "Still no sign of Danny. You want us to start looking?" Marco typed back. "Hold position. Something else is happening." He needed more information before he acted. Moving too quickly could put the child in more danger. But waiting too long might mean losing his only chance to help her. The man at their table stood up abruptly. "I'm going to make a call," he announced, his hand briefly squeezing the woman's shoulder in what looked like affection, but felt like a warning. As he walked toward the restaurant's rear exit, Marco caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. The outline of a gun barely visible beneath the man's jacket. Marco had two choices. He could mind his own business, wait for Danny, and handle his own problems like he'd planned. Or he could intervene in a situation that had nothing to do with him, potentially exposing his location and putting his own operation at risk. But then he looked at the little girl again, saw the way she glanced hopefully toward the exit where the man had disappeared, as if calculating whether she could run. Marco Benedetti had done terrible things in his life. He'd ordered deaths, destroyed families, and built an empire on fear and violence. But he'd never hurt a child, and he'd never walked away from one who needed help. His hand moved to his phone, fingers hovering over Sal's number. The next few minutes would determine whether this quiet Friday night dinner turned into a rescue mission or a massacre. The decision crystallized in Marco's mind like ice forming on glass. He pressed Sal's number. "Change of plans," he whispered into the phone, his eyes never leaving the woman and child. "I need you to run a plate for me. Black sedan, 3 cars down from the main entrance. And Sal, do it quiet." "Boss, what about Danny?" "Danny can wait. We've got a bigger problem." Marco ended the call and studied the restaurant layout with tactical precision. 2 exits, 17 tables, roughly 40 civilians, and at least 3 of his own men positioned throughout the room. The man with the gun had been gone for 4 minutes now, too long for a simple phone call. The little girl's head snapped up suddenly, her eyes wide with fresh panic. She was staring toward the back of the restaurant where the man had disappeared. Marco followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. The man was returning, but he wasn't alone. Another figure walked beside him, shorter, stockier, with the kind of walk that suggested military training. This second man's jacket hung loose, deliberately concealing what Marco knew was certainly another weapon. The woman at the table saw them coming, and her face went ashen. She reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing it so tightly the little girl winced. Marco's phone buzzed. Sal's response was faster than expected. Sedans registered to a shell company. Same company owns a warehouse in the industrial district. Boss, this doesn't smell right. Shell companies, warehouses, armed escorts. The pieces were forming a picture Marco had seen before, one that made his blood boil with a fury he rarely allowed himself to feel. Human trafficking. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a custody dispute or a family argument. This was something far worse. The woman and child weren't just in danger. They were merchandise. The two men reached the table, and Marco watched the choreography of control play out. The original man sat down while his partner remained standing, positioning himself where he could watch both the table and the room. Classic protection formation, but they weren't protecting the family. They were guarding their investment. The little girl's coloring crayon rolled off the table and clattered to the floor. When she bent to pick it up, she glanced once more toward Marco. This time, her message was different. Her lips moved silently, forming words only he could read. Please. Marco's hand moved to his jacket, fingers brushing the grip of his pistol. But starting a gunfight in a crowded restaurant would be suicide legally and tactically. Too many witnesses, too many innocent people, too much exposure. He needed a different approach. Standing slowly, Marco smoothed his suit jacket and walked toward the restroom area, passing close enough to the family's table to overhear fragments of conversation. Flight leaves at 11, the first man was saying. We need to be at the pickup point by 10:30. The package is getting restless, the second man replied, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone discussing cargo rather than human beings. Package. The same word he'd heard on the phone call. In the restroom, he dialed another number. This time, it wasn't one of his lieutenants. Detective Walsh, it's Marco. Yeah, I know what time it is. I need a favor. And before you say no, remember who kept your daughter out of that mess with the Colombians last year. Walsh's voice was weary but attentive. What do you need? I'm at Castellanos on 5th Street. Table near the back has a trafficking situation. Woman and a child. 2 armed escorts. They're talking about a flight at 11. Marco, I can't just take your word and raid a restaurant based on the kid pass me a note asking for help. Walsh, I've done a lot of terrible things in my life, but I don't lie about children in danger. A long pause. I'll send a unit for a wellness check, but if this is some kind of setup, it's not. And detective, tell them to come quiet. These guys are armed and jumpy. Marco ended the call and checked his watch. 9:34. If the police moved fast, they could intercept before any transfer occurred. But if they were too slow, or if the traffickers spooked and decided to cut their losses, he couldn't take that chance. Walking back through the restaurant, Marco made a decision that would either save 2 lives or end his own criminal career in spectacular fashion. He approached the family's table directly. Excuse me, he said, his voice carrying the polite authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I'm Marco Benedetti, and I believe your daughter dropped this. He held up the crumpled napkin. The effect was immediate and electric. The first man's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket. The second man shifted his weight, ready to draw. The woman's eyes went wide with a mixture of hope and terror, but it was the little girl's reaction that mattered most. She looked up at Marco with the kind of desperate gratitude that could break a hardened heart. I'm sorry, the first man said, his voice tight with barely controlled aggression. Do we know you? Marco smiled, the expression cold enough to freeze blood. No, but I know you, and more importantly, I know what you're doing. The restaurant suddenly felt quieter, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. At surrounding tables, other diners continued their conversations, oblivious to the fact that they were witnessing the opening moves of what could become a war. I think there's been a misunderstanding, the second man said, his hand now openly resting on his concealed weapon. The only misunderstanding, Marco replied, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout, is you thinking you could conduct business in my city without my knowledge. The woman looked confused, not understanding the criminal terminology being exchanged above her head, but the little girl understood perfectly. She'd grown up in this world of coded threats and veiled violence. Her small hand crept across the table toward her mother's, seeking comfort in what might be their last moments together. That gesture, so innocent and terrifying, made Marco's decision for him. He pulled out his phone and sent a single text message to Sal. Now, within 30 seconds, 3 of Marco's men appeared at strategic locations throughout the restaurant. Not obvious enough to alarm the other diners, but visible enough to send a clear message to the traffickers. They were surrounded. Here's what's going to happen, Marco said, settling into an empty chair at their table without invitation. You're going to sit quietly, order dessert, and wait for some friends of mine to arrive. And if you do anything at all that puts this woman or child in danger, I will personally ensure that your last moments on Earth are more painful than you can possibly imagine. The first man's face flushed with anger and fear. You have no idea who you're messing with. Marco leaned forward, his eyes becoming chips of black ice. I'm Marco Benedetti. I own this city from the docks to the suburbs. I've killed men for looking at me wrong, and I've started wars over matters of principle. But most importantly, I've never ever let anyone hurt a child in my presence. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. In the distance, barely audible over the restaurant's ambient noise, came the sound of sirens approaching. The little girl heard them too. For the first time since Marco had been watching, she smiled. The sirens grew louder, cutting through the restaurant's ambient chatter like a blade through silk. Marco watched the 2 traffickers exchange panicked glances, their carefully constructed facade cracking under pressure. The first man's phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at the screen, his face going pale. We need to leave now. Nobody's leaving, Marco said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, especially not with them. The woman finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Who are you people? What's happening? Marco turned to her, his expression softening just enough to seem human. Ma'am, your nightmare is about to end. But I need you to trust me and stay very still. The little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve. Mommy, the nice man is helping us. Nice man. Marco almost smiled at that. He'd been called many things, but nice wasn't one of them. Yet somehow, this 8-year-old had seen past his reputation to something deeper. The second trafficker was growing agitated, his hand twitching toward his concealed weapon. This is insane. We're walking out of here right now. Try it, Marco said, his tone dropping to absolute zero. See what happens. As if summoned by his words, Sal appeared beside their table, his massive frame blocking any potential escape route. Behind him, Marco could see his other men moving into position, casual, but deadly. The restaurant's front door chimed, and 2 plain detectives entered, their trained eyes immediately scanning the room. Detective Walsh was one of them, a thin man with gray hair and the weathered look of someone who'd seen too much. Marco caught Walsh's eye and gave the slightest nod toward their table. The detective's gaze shifted to the family, taking in the woman's terrified expression, the little girl's tear-stained cheeks, and the 2 men who looked like they were seconds away from bolting. Evening, folks, Walsh said, approaching with his badge visible, but not threatening. We received a call about a possible disturbance. Everything all right here? The first trafficker forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. Just a family dinner, officer. No problems here. Is that so? Walsh's partner, a younger detective with sharp eyes, focused on the woman. Ma'am, are you here voluntarily? The woman's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Years of conditioning, threats, and fear had taught her that speaking up only made things worse. But the little girl had no such conditioning. They took us from our house, she said, her voice clear and strong despite her tears. They said we were going on a trip, but we didn't want to go. The man said bad things would happen to Mommy if I didn't behave. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Walsh's hand moved instinctively to his service weapon while his partner stepped closer to the family. Sweetheart, the second detective said gently, can you tell me your name? Sophia. Martinez. This is my mommy, Carmen. We live on Oak Street. But these men came to our house 3 days ago. 3 days. Marco felt a cold rage building in his chest. These monsters had been terrorizing a mother and child for 3 days, and nobody had noticed they were missing. The first trafficker made his move then, lunging to his feet and reaching for his gun. But he'd forgotten about Sal, who moved with surprising speed for such a large man. The trafficker's wrist cracked audibly as Sal twisted it, sending the weapon clattering across the floor. The second man tried to run, but Marco was ready. He rose smoothly, intercepting the fleeing trafficker with a precise movement that sent him crashing into an empty table. The restaurant erupted into chaos. Diners screamed and dove for cover. Chairs overturned. Glasses shattered. But through it all, Marco kept his eyes on Sophia and Carmen, making sure they stayed safe. "Get them out of here," he told Walsh, who was already moving to shield the family. "Marco," the detective said quietly, "I need you to step back. Let us handle this." "They're handled," Marco replied, watching as Sal zip-tied both traffickers while they groaned on the floor. "But this is bigger than just these two idiots." He pulled out his phone and showed Walsh a series of text messages Sal had forwarded. Bank transfers, warehouse addresses, shipping schedules. They're part of a network. Shell companies, offshore accounts, the whole operation. This family was supposed to be on a cargo ship by midnight, heading to God knows where. Walsh studied the information, his expression growing darker. "How did you get all this?" Marco's smile was razor-sharp. "I have my methods. But detective, if you want to shut down the entire pipeline, you need to move fast. They've got more people, more locations." The little girl, Sophia, had been watching this exchange with wide eyes. Now she approached Marco, tugging on his expensive suit jacket. "Mister," she said, "are you a good guy or a bad guy?" The question hit Marco like a physical blow. He'd spent his entire adult life being unquestionably the bad guy. He'd hurt people, destroyed lives, built an empire on fear and violence. But tonight, for the first time in decades, he'd used that power to protect the innocent. He knelt down to Sophia's eye level, his voice gentle in a way that would have shocked his enemies. "I'm complicated, sweetheart, but tonight I'm on your side." Sophia nodded solemnly, then surprised him by wrapping her small arms around his neck in a fierce hug. "Thank you for saving us." Marco felt something crack inside his chest. Some wall he'd built years ago crumbling under the weight of a child's gratitude. Carmen Martinez finally found her voice. "I don't understand what happened. Who were those men? Why did they take us?" Walsh exchanged a glance with Marco before answering. "Ma'am, you and your daughter were victims of human trafficking. These men were planning to sell you." The words hung in the air like poison. Carmen's legs gave out, and she would have collapsed if Sal hadn't caught her arm. "But why us?" she whispered. "We're nobody special. We don't have money or connections." "That's exactly why," Marco said grimly. "People who won't be missed right away. Single mothers, children, immigrants, anyone society tends to overlook." He turned to Walsh. "Detective, they mentioned a warehouse in the industrial district. Shell company called Atlantic Holdings. If you move now, you might catch the rest of the operation." Walsh was already on his radio, calling for backup and search warrants. Within minutes, the restaurant was swarming with federal agents, local police, and crime scene investigators. Marco watched it all unfold with the satisfaction of a job well done. But he also knew his night was far from over. Danny still hadn't shown up, which meant either he was dead, in hiding, or planning something even more dangerous. Sophia appeared at his side again, having broken away from the paramedics who were checking her over. "Marco," she said, "will you make sure they don't come back for us?" The question revealed a wisdom beyond her years. She understood that removing two men didn't eliminate the threat. These organizations had tentacles everywhere, connections that ran deep into legitimate businesses and corrupt officials. Marco looked at this brave little girl who had risked everything on the hope that a stranger might help her and made a decision that would change the trajectory of his entire criminal career. "Sophia," he said, "I promise you that no one will ever hurt you or your mother again. I give you my word." It was a promise that would cost him millions in protection expenses, require him to declare war on trafficking operations throughout the city, and force him to walk a line between his criminal empire and something resembling justice. But as he watched Sophia's face light up with relief and hope, Marco realized that some promises were worth any price. The little girl who had written help on a napkin had done more than save herself and her mother. She had reminded a monster that somewhere deep inside, he still had a soul worth saving. And that revelation would shake the criminal underworld to its very foundations. The warehouse raid that followed would become legend in law enforcement circles. Within 2 hours of Sophia's rescue, federal agents had surrounded the Atlantic Holdings facility like a steel trap closing. What they found inside defied their worst expectations. 43 people, men, women, children, all scheduled for transport within the next 6 hours. The operation was bigger than anyone had imagined, with connections stretching from the Canadian border down to Mexico and beyond. But Marco wasn't there to see the arrests. He had other business to attend to. At 11:47 p.m., his phone finally rang. Danny, the ghost who had started this entire evening. Marco came the familiar voice, though it carried an edge Marco had never heard before. Heard you caused quite a scene at Castellano's tonight. Where are you, Danny? Close enough to know you just declared war on some very dangerous people. The Volkov organization doesn't forgive interference with their business operations. Marco felt ice form in his veins. The Volkovs, Russian Mafia, the most ruthless trafficking network on the East Coast. He just painted a target on his back that would never disappear. You set me up, Marco said. The pieces finally clicking into place. The meeting, the restaurant, the timing. You knew they'd be there. Danny laughed, but there was no warmth in it. I needed you distracted while I handled some unfinished business. Your warehouse on Pier 23, $3 million in cash and product. Consider it payment for all those years of friendship. The line went dead. Marco stared at his phone, realizing he'd been played by a master. While he was rescuing Sophia and Carmen, Danny had been robbing him blind. But the betrayal ran deeper than money. Danny had known about the trafficking operation, had probably been feeding information to the Volkovs for months. Marco's own lieutenant had been complicit in the horror they'd witnessed tonight. Sal appeared beside him, his face grim. Boss, Pier 23 is cleaned out. Professional job. They knew exactly where everything was hidden. How much? Everything. Cash reserves, product, the entire Eastern operation's liquid assets. Marco nodded slowly. In one night, he'd lost a fortune, gained deadly enemies, and discovered that his closest friend was a traitor. By any measure, it should have been a disaster. But when he looked back toward the restaurant where crime scene tape fluttered in the night breeze, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Sofia Martinez was safe. Her mother was safe. 43 other victims had been rescued. The trafficking network would be crippled for years. Sometimes the right choice was also the most expensive one. Marco's phone buzzed with a text from Detective Walsh. Federal Task Force wants to meet. They need someone with your connections to help dismantle the entire network. Interested in doing some good for once. Marco looked at the message for a long moment. Then he typed back, when and where. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight. Marco Benedetti was still the head of a criminal empire. Still a dangerous man with blood on his hands. But Sophia's napkin had started something that couldn't be undone. Within a week, word spread through the underworld that Marco's organization was off limits to human traffickers. Anyone caught moving people through his territory would face consequences that made prison look like a vacation. The Volkovs tested him twice. Both times their operations simply vanished without a trace. No bodies were ever found, but the message was clear. Children were untouchable. 3 months later, Marco received a drawing in the mail. It showed a stick-figure man in a black suit standing next to a little girl and her mother. Above it in purple crayon, Sophia had written, "Thank you for keeping your promise." He framed it and hung it in his office. Right next to a photo of his father, 2 reminders of what mattered most. Legacy wasn't about the empire you built or the enemies you destroyed. It was about the moments when you chose to be better than what the world expected. Marco Benedetti had spent 43 years being the monster everyone feared. But one 8-year-old girl with a crayon had reminded him that monsters could choose to be protectors instead. The war with the Volkovs would rage for years. Danny would eventually surface only to disappear again under circumstances that remained classified. The Federal Task Force would dismantle trafficking networks across 7 states using Marco's intelligence and connections. But none of that mattered as much as the simple truth Sophia had taught him that night. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is exactly who you want on your side when evil shows its face. And sometimes a crumpled napkin with one word written in crayon can change the entire course of a man's life. The monster at table 15 had become something else entirely. Something that would terrify the right people for all the right reasons. Because Marco Benedetti had learned that true power wasn't about being feared. It was about being the person a frightened child trusted to save her life. And that's the story of how one word written in purple crayon changed everything. Marco Benedetti walked into Castellano's that night expecting to confront a traitor and left having discovered something far more valuable than the millions Danny had stolen from him. Sofia Martinez taught him that true power isn't measured in fear or territory or blood spilled. It's measured in the moments when you choose to protect instead of destroy. When you use your strength to shield the innocent instead of crush your enemies. The trafficking network crumbled. 43 lives were saved, and a monster learned he could choose to be a guardian instead. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is exactly who a frightened child needs on their side. Sometimes evil wears expensive suits and sits at corner tables. And sometimes a crumpled napkin becomes the first domino in a chain reaction that reshapes an entire criminal empire. Marco kept that napkin in his wallet for the rest of his life. A reminder that redemption can come from the most unexpected places. Written in the shakiest handwriting, delivered by the smallest hands. 6 months after that night at Castellano's, Marco Benedetti stood in the abandoned warehouse that had once been Atlantic Holdings' main operations center. Federal agents had cleared out the last of the evidence weeks ago, but Marco returned here when he needed to think. The smell of fear and desperation still lingered in the concrete walls, a reminder of what he was fighting against. His phone buzzed with another threat from the Volkovs. The third one this week. They wanted him to know they hadn't forgotten about his interference with their business. They wanted him to understand that Sofia Martinez and her mother Carmen were still targets, that his protection meant nothing to them. Marco deleted the message without reading it completely. He'd heard variations of the same threat for months now. What the Volkovs didn't understand was that their threats only strengthened his resolve. Every menacing text, every dead animal left on his doorstep, every attempt to intimidate him only reminded him why he'd made his choice that night. The war had begun 3 days after Sofia's rescue. Marco's legitimate businesses started experiencing problems. Shipments went missing. Key employees received job offers they couldn't refuse. Computer systems crashed mysteriously. The Volkovs were methodical in their approach, applying pressure gradually while building towards something bigger. But Marco wasn't the same man he'd been 6 months ago. The old Marco would have responded with immediate violence, would have started a body count that wouldn't end until one organization was completely destroyed. This Marco was learning patience, strategy, and something his father had never taught him, restraint. His phone rang. Detective Walsh. Marco, we've got movement on 3 different fronts. The task force intercepted communications about a major shipment coming through the port tonight. They're moving the operation because of the heat we've put on them. How many people? Marco asked, already reaching for his jacket. At least 20, maybe more. They're using a cargo ship registered to a fishing company, but the manifest doesn't match the vessel size. It's bigger than they're claiming. Marco felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, but this time it was tempered with purpose. 6 months ago, he would have been planning how to take over the shipment for his own profit. Now he was calculating how many lives he could save. What do you need from me? He asked Walsh. Your connections. We know there's someone inside the Port Authority feeding them information, but we can't move until we identify the leak. Your people have better access than ours. Marco was already walking toward his car. I'll make some calls. Give me 30 minutes. Marco, Walsh said, his voice carrying a warning. Keep it clean. We can't afford any bodies that we can't explain. Marco smiled grimly. Don't worry, detective. I'm not the same man I was before. But as he hung up the phone, Marco knew that wasn't entirely true. He was still a killer. Still a man capable of terrible violence. The difference was in how he chose to use that violence, and who he chose to protect. The port stretched along the waterfront like a concrete maze, filled with containers, cranes, and ships from around the world. Marco had done business here for years, both legitimate and otherwise. He knew which guards could be bought, which supervisors looked the other way, and which dock workers would report unusual activity if properly motivated. Sal met him at the entrance, along with 2 other members of Marco's inner circle. Men who had been skeptical of their boss's new direction but had come to respect his commitment to it. "Boss," Sal said quietly, "we've got 3 potential sources inside the Port Authority. 2 supervisors and 1 crane operator. All of them have gambling debts. All of them have access to shipping schedules." Marco nodded. The classic recruitment pattern for corruption. Identify people with financial pressure. Offer them a solution that compromises them. Then use that compromise to ensure ongoing cooperation. "We're going to do this differently than usual," Marco told his men. "No intimidation, no threats. We're going to offer them a better deal." The first supervisor was a man named Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran of the Port Authority whose daughter needed surgery his insurance wouldn't cover. Marco found him in a small office overlooking the container yards, hunched over paperwork with the desperate intensity of someone trying to bury his problems in work. "Mr. Rodriguez," Marco said, stepping into the office without knocking. "I believe we have a mutual problem." Rodriguez looked up, his face immediately draining of color. He recognized Marco, knew exactly what kind of man had just walked into his office. "I don't know what you're talking about," Rodriguez stammered. Marco sat down across from him, his manner calm and unthreatening. "Your daughter needs surgery. The Volkovs offered to pay for it in exchange for shipping information. Now you're trapped between medical bills and criminal organizations, and you don't know how to get out." Rodriguez's hands started shaking. "I never meant for it to go this far. They said it was just container numbers, harmless information. I didn't know what they were really doing." Marco pulled out his phone and showed Rodriguez a bank transfer confirmation. $50,000, deposited into an account at the children's hospital where Rodriguez's daughter was scheduled for surgery. "This covers her medical expenses," Marco said. "All of them. In exchange, you give the police everything you have on the Volkovs. Phone numbers, contact procedures, scheduled shipments. Everything." Rodriguez stared at the phone screen, unable to believe what he was seeing. "Why would you do this?" "Because 6 months ago, a little girl wrote the word help on a napkin and changed the way I see the world," Marco replied. "Because you're not a criminal, you're a father trying to save his child. And because the people you've been helping traffic children just like your daughter." 20 minutes later, Detective Walsh had a complete breakdown of the Volkov's port operations, including the exact location of tonight's shipment and the names of everyone involved in the operation. The cargo ship Northwind sat low in the water at the far end of the industrial pier, surrounded by the kind of darkness that made illegal activities possible. But tonight, that darkness also concealed federal agents, local police, and Marco's own people working in coordination for the first time in either organization's history. Marco watched from a nearby warehouse roof as agents moved into position around the ship. Walsh's voice crackled through his earpiece. "We've got visual confirmation of at least 15 people being moved from the ship to a waiting truck. Moving to intercept now." What Marco witnessed over the next 30 minutes would stay with him for the rest of his life. Federal agents swarmed the operation from 3 directions simultaneously. The traffickers, caught completely off guard, surrendered without firing a shot. And when the cargo containers were opened, 22 people emerged into the night air, free for the first time in months. Among them was a little girl, maybe 7 years old, who looked around with the same terrified eyes Marco had seen in Sofia Martinez 6 months earlier. When she saw the police officers approaching, she didn't run toward them for help. She tried to hide behind one of the containers, convinced that all adults were dangerous. Marco made a decision that would have shocked his younger self. He climbed down from his observation post and walked directly into the middle of the federal operation. Detective Walsh looked up as Marco approached. "What are you doing here?" "This is a crime scene. There's a little girl hiding behind Container 7, Marco said. "She's terrified of the officers. Let me talk to her." Walsh started to object, then saw the expression on Marco's face. The same expression he'd seen that night at Castellano's when Marco had confronted the traffickers. 5 minutes, Walsh said. "Then you disappear." Marco found the girl crouched between 2 containers, shaking with terror. She couldn't have weighed more than 60 pounds, and her clothes hung on her like rags. When she saw Marco approaching, she pressed herself against the metal wall as if she could disappear into it. "Hey there," Marco said softly, crouching down to her level. "It's okay. You're safe now." The girl didn't respond, but her eyes tracked his movements with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that survival depended on reading threats correctly. "My name is Marco," he continued. "Those police officers, they're here to help you. They're going to make sure the bad people never hurt you again." Still no response. Marco reached into his pocket and pulled out something he'd been carrying for 6 months. Sophia's original napkin, the one with the word help written in purple crayon. "A little girl gave this to me once," Marco said, showing her the napkin. "She was scared, just like you. But she was also brave. She asked for help, and because she was brave enough to ask, we were able to save her and a lot of other people." The girl's eyes focused on the napkin, recognizing something in it that spoke to her own experience. "What's your name?" Marco asked gently. "Elena," the girl whispered. It was the first word she'd spoken since being rescued. "Elena, that's a beautiful name. Elena, the police officers are going to take you somewhere safe. Somewhere with warm beds and good food, and people who will take care of you. But first, they need you to be brave, just like the girl who wrote this note." Elena looked from the napkin to Marco's face, searching for something. Whatever she found there must have convinced her, because she took a small step toward him. "Will you walk with me to the police officers?" Marco asked. Elena nodded. As Marco led the frightened child toward the federal agents who would begin the long process of her recovery, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months ago, he had been a criminal who thought only of profit and power. Tonight, he was a man who understood that true strength came from protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The Volkov War would continue for months after that night. They would make attempts on Marco's life, target his businesses, and even try to kidnap Sofia Martinez in retaliation. But each attack only strengthened Marco's resolve and brought more allies to his cause. Detective Walsh became more than a contact within law enforcement. He became a friend and partner in building something unprecedented, a cooperation between organized crime and police that focused entirely on protecting children from trafficking. Agent Thompson, who had initially been skeptical of working with a known criminal, gradually came to respect Marco's commitment and effectiveness. The federal task force, using intelligence provided by Marco's network, dismantled trafficking operations across 7 states and rescued over 200 people in 18 months. But it was Sofia Martinez who remained the center of Marco's transformation. Every few weeks, she would send him drawings, crayon pictures of families, houses, and stick figure people holding hands. Each drawing was signed with her name and the same message: "Thank you for keeping us safe." Carmen Martinez had struggled initially with accepting protection from a man she knew was dangerous. But as weeks turned into months, and as she saw the genuine care Marco showed for her daughter's welfare, she began to understand that people could change, that redemption was possible even for those who seemed irredeemable. 1 year after the night at Castellanos, Marco received a phone call that would test everything he had learned about his new identity. Danny was back. "Marco," the familiar voice said, though it sounded older, wearier than Marco remembered. "I heard about your new career path. Saving children, working with the police. Very noble. Where are you?" "Danny," Marco asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Close enough to matter. Close enough to remind you that actions have consequences. You cost me millions with your little rescue operation. You destroyed my partnership with the Volkovs. You made me a target. You made yourself a target the moment you started trafficking children," Marco replied. "You chose money over humanity. You chose profit over friendship." Danny laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Always the idealist, even when we were kids. You think saving a few dozen people makes you a hero. You think working with cops erases 20 years of blood. It doesn't erase anything," Marco said. "But it means something. It means I choose who I am going forward, not who I was in the past." There was a long pause. When Danny spoke again, his voice carried a threat that Marco recognized from their childhood, the tone Danny used when he was about to do something unforgivable. "I'm going to take everything from you, Marco. Your business, your reputation, your new friends in law enforcement. And then I'm going to take the little girl who started all this. Sofia Martinez is going to pay for what you've done." The line went dead. Marco stared at his phone, feeling the cold rage of his old self beginning to surface. For a moment, he was tempted to handle this the way he would have handled it a year ago. Find Danny, kill him, eliminate the threat with brutal efficiency. But then he remembered Elena, the frightened child at the port who had trusted him enough to walk toward safety. He remembered Sofia's drawings, her innocent belief that he could protect her from the darkness in the world. He remembered the promise he had made to himself and to her that night at Castellanos. Marco picked up his phone and dialed Detective Walsh. "We have a problem," he said when Walsh answered. "Danny is planning to go after Sofia Martinez." "What do you need?" Walsh asked without hesitation. "Protection for the family, surveillance on all approaches to their location, and a trap. Danny wants me to know he's coming. That means he wants a confrontation. We're going to give him one, but on our terms." The final confrontation between Marco Benedetti and his former friend took place in the same warehouse where Sofia and Carmen Martinez had been held captive over a year earlier. Marco had chosen the location deliberately, wanting Danny to understand the full weight of what his trafficking operation had meant. Danny arrived with 6 men, all armed, all professionals. Marco came alone, as he had promised he would. But Danny's men didn't know about the federal agents positioned around the warehouse, or about Detective Walsh coordinating the operation from a surveillance bin 2 blocks away. "You actually came," Danny said as Marco walked into the warehouse. "I wasn't sure you developed that much spine in your new life as a good Samaritan." "I came because you threatened a child," Marco replied. "Because you crossed the one line I will never allow anyone to cross." Danny smiled, the same charming expression that had gotten them both out of trouble when they were teenagers. "Always the protector, even when we were kids. Remember when you beat up Tommy Castellano for picking on that girl with the limp?" "I remember," Marco said. "I also remember when you started making excuses for cruelty instead of stopping it." The 2 men faced each other across the empty warehouse floor, 20 years of friendship and betrayal hanging between them like a weight. "I could have been rich beyond imagination," Danny said. "The Volkovs were offering me a partnership that would have made us both incredibly powerful. But you chose to side with the victims instead of the victors." "I chose to side with children instead of the people who hurt them," Marco corrected. "I chose to be the kind of man my father would have been proud of, instead of the kind of man who would have disappointed him." Danny's expression hardened. "Your father was gunned down in the street like a dog. Where did his honor get him?" "It got him a son who learned the difference between strength and brutality," Marco replied. "It got him a legacy that means something beyond fear and money." Danny pulled out his gun, and his men followed suit. But Marco didn't move, didn't reach for his own weapon. "You're not going to fight?" Danny asked, confused by Marco's stillness. "I don't have to," Marco said calmly. "Because you've already lost." The warehouse doors burst open simultaneously from 3 directions. Federal agents poured in with tactical precision, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Danny's men found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered within seconds. But Danny himself kept his gun trained on Marco, even as Agent Thompson approached with his weapon drawn. "You set me up," Danny said, his voice filled with betrayal. "I gave you a choice," Marco replied. "You could have walked away from trafficking, could have found another way to make money. You chose to threaten a child instead." Danny's finger moved toward the trigger, but he never got the chance to fire. Detective Walsh, approaching from an angle Danny hadn't seen, put 2 bullets in Danny's shoulder, spinning him around, and sending his weapon flying across the warehouse floor. As paramedics worked to stabilize Danny and federal agents processed his men, Marco stood in the warehouse where so many victims had suffered and felt a profound sense of completion. The man who had introduced him to crime was going to prison for the rest of his life. The organization that had threatened Sofia was dismantled. The war was over. 3 years after the night at Castellanos, Marco Benedetti sat in a small coffee shop, waiting for a meeting that would have been impossible to imagine when he was building his criminal empire. Across from him sat Angela Morrison, director of the newly created Federal Task Force on Human Trafficking, and beside her, Detective Walsh, who had been promoted to head the task force's local operations. "Marco," Angela said, spreading a file across the table between them, "we want to offer you something unprecedented. A formal consultation role with the task force. Legal immunity for past crimes in exchange for continued cooperation in anti-trafficking operations." Marco studied the documents, understanding their significance. This wasn't just about fighting crime. It was about transformation, about using his knowledge of criminal organizations to protect the innocent instead of exploiting them. "What would this involve?" he asked. "Intelligence gathering, strategic planning, occasionally going undercover to infiltrate trafficking networks. You would essentially be doing what you've been doing for the past 3 years, but with official government backing and resources." "And my organization?" Marco asked. "My people." Any members who want to participate in legitimate operations would be welcome. Those who prefer to continue traditional criminal activities would need to understand that you're no longer available to protect them. Marco thought about Sal, who had gradually transitioned from enforcer to security consultant, about the dozen other men in his organization who had found purpose in protecting victims instead of creating them, about the businesses he had slowly converted from fronts for illegal activities to genuine enterprises that employed former criminals looking for second chances. I accept, Marco said, but I have conditions. Name them, Angela replied. Sofia Martinez and her mother remain under permanent protection. Any operation that risks exposing them gets canceled. And I want the right to approve any undercover assignments that involve children. Angela nodded. Agreed. There's one more thing, Marco. We've received authorization to offer you a new identity if you want it. Clean background, legitimate credit history, the works. Marco considered the offer, tempted by the possibility of starting completely fresh. But then he thought about Sofia's drawings, about the scared children he'd helped rescue, about the reminder of who he had been and who he had chosen to become. Thank you, but no, he said. Marco Benedetti made mistakes, terrible ones. But Marco Benedetti also learned to do better. I don't want to forget either part of that story. 5 years after the night that changed his life, Marco received an invitation that brought tears to his eyes. It was handwritten on formal stationery, decorated with small drawings in the margins. Dear Marco, the invitation read in careful cursive handwriting. You are invited to my high school graduation. I got into college with a scholarship to study criminal justice. I want to help people the way you helped me. Thank you for showing me that heroes come in all different forms. Love, Sofia Martinez. Marco sat in the third row of the graduation ceremony, watching as Sofia walked across the stage to receive her diploma. She had grown into a confident, intelligent young woman who spoke 4 languages and planned to work with immigrant children as a victim advocate. When the ceremony ended, Sofia found him in the crowd and threw her arms around him in the same fierce hug she had given him as an 80-year-old child in a restaurant. I kept my promise, Marco said quietly. You kept all your promises, Sofia replied. And you taught me that it's never too late to change who you are. Carmen Martinez approached, older now, but with the same grateful expression she'd worn the night her daughter was saved. Thank you, she said to Marco. Not just for that night, but for every day since. For showing Sofia that there are good people in the world willing to fight for children. Marco looked around at the families celebrating their children's achievements, at the future unfolding in the graduates' faces, at the possibilities that existed when good people chose to act instead of looking away. Sometimes, he thought, the most important battles are fought not with weapons or violence, but with the simple decision to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Sometimes redemption comes not through grand gestures, but through the daily choice to be better than you were the day before. As he watched Sofia pose for pictures with her family, Marco touched the wallet in his jacket pocket, where a small piece of paper remained folded after all these years. One word, written in purple crayon by a frightened child who had trusted a stranger to save her. Help. It was the word that had changed everything. The word that had shown him who he could become instead of who he had been. The word that had taught him that true power came not from inspiring fear, but from inspiring hope. Marco Benedetti walked away from that graduation ceremony, knowing that his transformation was complete. He was no longer the monster from Table 15, no longer the criminal who built empires on fear and violence. He was the man who answered when children called for help, who used his strength to shield the innocent, who had learned that redemption was possible even for those who seemed beyond saving. The napkin in his wallet remained his most treasured possession, a reminder that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, written in the shakiest handwriting, delivered by the smallest hands. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is exactly who a frightened child needs on their side. And sometimes a single word written in crayon can change not just one life, but hundreds of lives, creating ripples of protection and hope that spread far beyond anything the original writer could have imagined. Sofia Martinez had asked for help, and in doing so, had saved not just herself and her mother, but had rescued the soul of a man who thought he was beyond redemption. Her courage had created a new kind of family, one built not on blood or crime, but on the shared commitment to protect those who needed protection most. In the end, that was Marco Benedetti's true legacy. Not the empire he had built or the enemies he had destroyed, but the children he had saved, the lives he had protected, and the proof that even the darkest hearts could learn to beat with compassion instead of cruelty. The monster at table 15 was gone forever. In his place stood a guardian, a protector, a man who had learned that true strength came not from being feared, but from being the person frightened children could trust to keep them safe. This incredible story has reached its end. If Marco and Sophia's journey of courage, transformation, and ultimate redemption touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and let us know in the comments what you thought of their powerful bond. Your support means everything and helps us continue bringing you these incredible tales of hope conquering darkness. Until next time.